Still perfect in the win-loss column. How about on the field? Well, we will dissect what happened at Nippert Stadium and look ahead to another game in the Big 12 against a more familiar foe. We got Oklahoma Sooners live here at the Voice of College Football. As always, Jason Ray's here, our host for Sooner Tailgate and for the post-game show here at OU live right here at the Voice of College Football. You may be watching on the SD1 Sports channel as well. We appreciate them hosting our show as well. We've got a new Big 12 channel, so please subscribe there. We will drop the link in the chat. Jason, how you doing today?
Doing good, Mark. Thanks for having me on as always.
Of course. Thanks for having me on. These are pretty much your shows. So without Jason, we don't have a show here. So we appreciate Jason being here. Of course, 131 shows, and Jason has been here for just about all of them. The effort in Cincinnati, I don't know if that would be termed workmanlike or methodical. You could put a lot of positive spins on it from an offensive standpoint. There's little to take from it from a defensive standpoint that would be negative. The offense, you can go one way or the other, but it obviously wasn't explosive, decisive. There wasn't necessarily a statement made by the offense, but we did know that the Bearcats had a strong defensive front. So what are your initial takeaways?
Yeah, I think, Mark, when you at least this way for me, even from a basketball perspective, being a coach and then just kind of watching it, being a fan and just an observer, I think it's always not quite when you rewatch the game again. It's always not quite as bad as what you thought it was initially when you look through it, and so I think that's very much the case here. Now, when you look at it just kind of at a macro level, you look at 20 points. That's probably not going to get it done in the Big 12. That's not, it's not what you're looking for. And I think certainly that's correct. But I think, it's one story if, Oklahoma only scored 20 points and they struggled to score those 20 points. However, I think very optimistic for Oklahoma fans watching this game is they left probably a good 21 to 24 points on the field. Dylan Gabriel had a fumble near the goal line. There, he missed a couple of throws down the middle of the field. A couple of them would have been touchdowns there. So there was a lot of opportunities that were missed that they left on the field, I think. So I think you take that as a positive, but also at the same time, there's certain aspects of the offense that absolutely have to be better. There is it's kind of funny to kind of talk through, but there's very much like it was last year. There is a war on social media amongst Oklahoma fans. There's the group that says, Dylan Gabriel is so much more improved than he was a year ago. He's completing passes at a very, very high level. He's still, even with Saturday, he's in the 80% range in terms of completion percentage, is one of the top quarterbacks in the country as far as that goes. But there was you saw a little bit of a reversion in terms of missing some open guys, making some bad decisions. So at times, not completely bad decisions. There was a couple of times where he kept the ball instead of giving it off on the zone replay. There was just a completely head scratching awful play where he's under pressure and he basically dumps the ball behind the line. Thankfully, it goes out of bounds because it would have been a turnover if Cincinnati would have recovered it. And so I think it's kind of a split situation, Mark, where you have a half of the fan base thinks, okay, when is enough? Are we going to see Jackson Arnold get an opportunity? And then there's a half of the fan base, the more, I would say, and I apologize if you're in the first half, the more logical fan base that says, okay, they're just a little bit off on some things, and that will hopefully improve. So, he reminds me, Mark, when you and I've had a couple of fans that I'm close with, and a couple of people really close to the situation. He very much is Landry Jones, like reincarnated, in the fact that Landry was one of those guys, and he's the all-time leading passer at the University of Oklahoma, and he's probably going to be that for quite some time because he played and started for a good 4 years, right? I mean, you just don't see that happen in this day and age. Kids aren't 4-year starters at the quarterback position. They're leaving early for the NFL or whatever it might be. So, but in the same mode, he's a guy that, and Gabriel is just like this. He can be very consistent for games and quarters, and then all of a sudden the inconsistency is there. So I think ultimately at the end of the day, they just need him to be a little bit more consistent in hitting those open guys, making the solid decisions. And it seems to be when he's a little bit more in a pressure cooker when things like that happen. So I'm going to be very interested, Mark, to see how he. And I say bounce back, like he certainly didn't have an awful game, but when you look at some of the throws that he missed that left some of those points on the board, it'll be this could have looked a lot more impressive. This could have even if you connect on a couple of those, if you look at 34-6 versus 20-6. So I think the offensive line actually played a little bit better than I even anticipated going up against the front for Cincinnati. But the running back situation continues to be an anomaly. Again, we saw a situation this week where Javonte Barnes and Gavin Sawchuk basically got no carries. Gavin Sawchuk didn't see the field. Javonte Barnes, I believe, was on the field a couple of plays. And there was some questions to Brent Venables in his press conference this week where Venables really kind of talked about, we're just looking for somebody to separate themselves, and no one really has, I think, at this point, which is concerning 4 weeks into the season at this point. You would like to see one separate themselves. I think the situation with Gavin Sawchuk is, he had an injury in fall camp, and he's really just not in game shape. So I think that's the concern with him. I don't know what the situation is with Javonte Barnes. I just don't. I don't know if he's in the doghouse. I don't know if he's not practicing well, and that's not allowing the coaching staff to have a lot of trust in him come game time. But I think that's probably the running game is a big concern because you could see watching that game, they have no confidence in the running game. Now it got going a little bit in the second half, early on in the third quarter, but you've got to have that complementary run game, to be able to be as efficient as you want to on the offensive side of the ball. So it's kind of interesting, Mark, over the last however many years, just name the years and you can go down that path, that it's the conversation's always been on the opposite side, right? It's always been, offense is putting a lot of points on the board, but the defense can't get stops. Now it's a little bit transverse right now, right? I mean, I think if you're an Oklahoma fan, you're past the point of being concerned if this is fool's gold like it was last year, but is the team as dominant as you think that they are defensively? I mean, anytime you go on the road and you give up 6 points, I mean, that's a tremendous defensive performance. Whereas last year, once they got into conference season, the wheels started falling off. They gave up 40 points to Kansas State and TCU and Texas back to back to back. And so what they were able to do on Saturday was really, really impressive, holding Cincinnati. Now, Cincinnati's not an offensive juggernaut by any stretch of the imagination, but still, it's much better than the defense has been played around here in quite some time. So I think there's a lot of happy campers in Oklahoma's camp, so to speak, with what Venables has been able to do to really kind of turn this defense around, at least to the point of where it was last year. But I think the jury's still out a bit offensively if this team can score enough points against the really solid teams to win a championship or compete for a championship in the Big 12 this year.
Yeah, this was a talking point during the offseason, obviously, as every position unit is, but we thought we had it nailed down considering the production at the end of the year, the production in particular at the bowl game, and obviously their recruiting rankings and their talent and everything that was expected of those two, Gavin Sawchuk and Javante Barnes. Then we come into this season, the Arkansas State game, without looking up the numbers, was just this kind of potpourri of everybody got the ball about 5 times. They just played everybody 73 points, obviously. So then you move on to the next week, and suddenly it's Tyree Walker with a 100-yard performance and getting the ball about 20 or 21 carries. And then, Barnes and Sawchuk are completely absent from that game against SMU. And then it was the Tulsa game. They come back and they have, I think, a combined 22 carries between them, and Walker's barely on the field. And then you come back in this game against Cincinnati, and Marcus Majors, the guy with 15 carries,
Yep.
Walker with 5, and the other two nowhere to be found.
It's bizarre, Mark. It's bizarre. I mean, I think each season brings its own for each team, right? I mean, I think each season brings its own share of surprises, things that are going well that maybe you thought was a big question mark, and maybe things that you thought were not a question mark at all are not necessarily going as well as you expected. And I think that can be the case for Oklahoma. Coming into the season, even in fall camp, the running back room was not something that I thought that we would have a lot of discussion about, just in terms of guys being ready. I thought coming in, Oklahoma had probably one of the better running back groups in the Big 12 and maybe even the country, right? I mean, certainly not the best, but with what Barnes was able to do last year, and combined with what Barnes and Sawchuk both did against Florida State in the bowl game last year, both running for over 100 yards, I think a lot of us expected that to be a clear strength of the team offensively, and it just hasn't. Like I said, for whatever reason, part of it's injuries, and the thing with Barnes, like I said, I don't know what that's about specifically, and I don't think anyone knows at this point. I mean, I think people are making the assumption that it's related to practice habits, or he's in the doghouse, or whatever, because he didn't just all of a sudden not become good from last year to this year, right? So yeah, I didn't think that was going to be a concern, but I think the one thing has been, at least early on, a very pleasant surprise is the receiving core. It was a group that without Marvin Mims didn't really have a huge established leader, and now that they've got 3 or 4, maybe even 5 guys that that they can count on. Nick Anderson's a kid that's really coming on. He had another touchdown on Saturday. Andrel Anthony is becoming kind of the deep threat, almost kind of a go-to guy. He had 7 catches for 117 yards Saturday, and Jalil Farouk is still doing what he does. He's very, very consistent and constant. So it's interesting as conference season comes into play with the perceived kind of weakness on the running back side, and even the offensive line to a certain degree, if they're not even able to get to a high level. I mean, if you're Oklahoma, are you a team that's looking at, is Dylan Gabriel going to have to throw the ball 35 to 45 times a game for Oklahoma to win in these games where you're playing a really strong defense? And I know Iowa State's got some, certainly not the best team in the conference this year for sure, but they played pretty well offensively on Saturday against Oklahoma State, and they're a pretty good defensive team. They have been over the last few years under Campbell. So, but as a team coming into Texas in 2 weeks, so yeah, that's interesting. I think obviously, as I mentioned, not what we expected coming into the season, but it is what it is, and I think that's where we're at with this team. So looking at ways, how can Oklahoma improve offensively in terms of the running back room, not necessarily just improve the production, because it's not what Oklahoma has seen a lot in the past. And and it could be timing plays. I mean, situations where some of these guys didn't really get a lot of run early on in fall practice with the first team, and so they're really kind of getting used to that, but and used to seeing what what fits. I think it was very interesting to see that Oklahoma did a lot of inside zone, a little bit of outside zone against Cincinnati, but more of kind of a zone scheme blocking concept. Now in the second half, you saw a little bit more of that gap scheme that they had been made famous by when Lincoln Riley was here. That guard tackle over, you saw a lot of pulling action in the second half, and that was a lot more successful for Oklahoma. So I think that will be something to kind of look for, Mark, and against Iowa State. And then moving forward, is do they change their bread and butter? Is the offensive line a little bit better from a run blocking perspective and more of a gap scheme versus a zone scheme? And then does that maybe fit the talent of Marcus Major and Tawi Walker, if those two are going to be the guys right now, in terms of getting a little bit more production out of the running game?
Yeah, if there appears to be a team that's emerging as a team that is the tonic for whatever ills you at the time, Oklahoma State's becoming that team for Iowa State to put up 348 yards passing, 3 touchdowns. Now, Oklahoma State on the surface, if you just look at the record, 2-2. Well, they beat Central Arkansas and didn't do it impressively by like 2 touchdowns against an FCS team. They went to Arizona State, which, my goodness, they did win the game over Arizona State. It was an extremely ugly game, and then Arizona State turned around and lost to Fresno State 29-0. I don't know how a team gets shut out in college football these days. And now Iowa State puts up 34. I don't know that Iowa State's seen 34 points against an FBS team in a couple years. And again, Rocco Becht, of course, Taylor Decker suspended for the season. Rocco Becht and dismissed from the program. 27 of 38, 348, 3 touchdowns. So they did most of their work through the air, which is unlike Iowa State with only 74 yards on the ground. So while that's a good sign for them, I don't know if that's some fool's gold. And when they run into Oklahoma's defense, I would expect things to revert to the norm.
Yeah, I would expect that too, Mark. I think I don't know what's going on with Oklahoma State. It's such a strange situation there. But specifically with Iowa State, I watched a good portion of that game against Oklahoma State, and they still struggled to run the ball. I think they ran the ball for less than 100 yards. But to your point, Beck threw for, I think, what was it, 348 through the air. He's only got 897 yards passing on the season, so he's got 600 and some change in the previous 3 games, and then 300 in that one. And and I watched how anemic they were offensively against Ohio the previous week, only putting 7 points on the board. So yeah, I agree with you, Mark. I think it'll come. The only thing you have to guard against, I think, this week for Oklahoma is, and they passed this with flying colors earlier on in the year. I thought Tulsa could have been a little bit of a trap game, but this one absolutely is got trap written all over it. Now, I think there's some things that are being done that will maybe guard that a little bit. They are, and kids love this. Obviously, they have the new Unity uniforms, alternate uniforms that they're breaking out this weekend. It's a big recruiting weekend. They've got David Stone and one of his offensive line teammates that Oklahoma is trying to get in on Jordan Seaton, one of the top offensive linemen in the country, is coming in for a visit. So they've got a lot of recruiting stuff going on. It's a night game. that always gets the fans maybe a little bit more involved than they would if it was an 11 a.m. game against Iowa State. So I think there's some things there. But when I think about this, Mark, when you think about this from a player's perspective, and obviously they see scores, they watch film. I don't really see how there's any way they're actually fired up to play Iowa State, knowing that Texas is next weekend. So I think you still have to guard against the look ahead a little bit, and I think that's the only thing for me, Mark, that would keep this game within the numbers is the look ahead. Iowa State's defense is probably going to keep them somewhat competitive in this game, at least early on. But I would be surprised if Oklahoma isn't in a position where they're pulling away in the third or fourth quarter, just because of how bad Iowa State has been minus one game this year offensively. I think they're averaging less than 3 yards a carry for the season. That's even when you include their game one against Northern Iowa. Somehow they gave, and I'll have to go back and look at this, Mark. I'm trying to remember the score of this game, but somehow they ended up giving up what was it, 20 points? I mean, only 20 points to Iowa earlier on in the season. So yeah, I think this will be a situation where Oklahoma, if they come and they're ready to play and they're interested in the game, they should be able to hit I think it's 20. I think the line is still 20, but hit that number this week against Iowa State.
Maybe one motivation would be that Iowa State did win this game for any of the players, and I don't know what that number is, but it's got to be at least half the roster that was around last season for that game. So there is a bit of payback, and not that these players have experienced previous losses to that against Iowa State, but it's been a series that is completely lopsided. But with Matt Campbell doing some good work early in his tenure at Iowa State, of course, they pulled off a couple upsets a few years ago, and then they did again win the game last season by, I believe, 2 scores. I believe it was a 1-score game until extremely late in the game. And then, or was it the other way around? Oklahoma won by 2 scores. Now I'm getting mixed up in terms of last year's game.
Yeah, Oklahoma won that game last year. Yeah.
It's like 27-14, something like that. Okay, I got that turned around. So there wouldn't be many players who have lost to Iowa State on this team, because you would have to go back to 2020 for that.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So forget my motivation. So that's out the door. Yeah.
Well, and I think part of it, Mark, when you look at it, how Oklahoma started in their first home conference game last year against Kansas State, and just really, did not play well in that game. Ended up losing, and that caused kind of a string of losing streak there, 3 games to start conference season with Kansas State, TCU, and Texas, certainly. So I think there's that motivation, right? I think that they really want to be undefeated going into the game against Texas. And Mark, it's something that they haven't. I'm surprised there hasn't been more made of this from the Oklahoma side, but I really haven't heard any of it. You can imagine this was the most for Oklahoma last year. This was the most lopsided loss that they've had in Red River, I think, in the history of the rivalry. So not only losing that, but getting shut out. There's always a lot of motivation for that game, but I'm sure Oklahoma has maybe a little bit more, coming in this year. And so, I know we'll have plenty of time to break that down. But, one of the interesting things coming into this game is Oklahoma is the perceived underdog going into that game against Texas. And it hasn't happened very often over the last, 10 to 15 years. Oklahoma hasn't been a considerable underdog coming into that game outside of last year. So yeah, I think there's going to be ample motivation for there not to be any sort of a slip up, and still want to be continuing to play at a high level this week as you roll into Dallas next weekend.
Yes, 118 games in Red River, and that is the largest margin of victory, 49-0 on the Texas side, 65-13 Oklahoma in 2003. So, yes, that was something else to watch. And, of course, Oklahoma was in a situation once they lost Dylan Gabriel the previous week that the quarterback situation was a complete mess, and you would think that they would be in a much better place this time around. Texas has looked... They haven't looked earth-shattering great or really any major concerns since the Alabama game. They've pretty much just gone about their business against Wyoming and Baylor. Yeah, yep. They took care of Baylor pretty easily, 38-6. Looked to be a much better and more sound defensive team than what they've been. Even though they've had the talent on that side of the ball, they've not executed, not always been interested in doing things like tackling in the past. But it looks like this group is focused and playing up to their talent level.
They really are, Mark. They and Baylor is not a great, or even could say a good football team this year, right? I mean, I thought initially when you saw the Texas State opening game, was that an aberration? It seems to be kind of what they are this year, Mark, specifically with Blake Shapen out of the game and Sawyer Robertson being the quarterback. They really couldn't get much of anything done offensively on Saturday. But I think I'm most impressed with Texas's defensive line. The way they handled Alabama's offensive line, and just how they've handled their business in these last couple of games, even though they sleptwalked a little bit through Wyoming, but still held Wyoming to 10 points. And so, yeah, I think defensively they're certainly much better. I think, obviously, the key to this game for me is when Quinn Ewers has struggled offensively, it's been when he's had a lot of pressure in his face and he's had to make some quick decisions, and he's not able to just kind of sit back there and pick apart the defense. So if Oklahoma if they can find a way to get some pressure on him and, really affect his vision, really make him be a little bit more of a runner, I think that's when Oklahoma, really has a chance to maybe slow them down. But yeah, no, they look, I think right now, clearly like the best team in the Big 12. Clearly look like a playoff team right now, coming into but they don't have the benefit of having. They have a tough game with Kansas this weekend, so it's not one of those things where they really have the luxury of looking ahead either. So that should be very interesting.
Great Cloud is a little concerned about the special teams. This could eventually cost us in a close game down the road.
Yeah, I think specifically, and I don't know if that's specifically what he's mentioning here, but I think more specifically the punting. The punting, Oklahoma's had a little bit of a luxury having Turk over the last couple of years, but Josh Plaster has got that job, and it's he's not able to flip the field in a solid way like Turk has kind of been able to over the last couple of years. So I'm just kind of going here, trying to find his stats. I don't have them right off the top of my head, but anyway, he's not able to flip the field like they have. So that's a little bit of a concern. The special teams aren't great, I think, in that area. They've had a couple of decent run backs from Jalil Farouk in terms of kickoff returns. Had the punt return early on against Arkansas State, but yeah, I mean, you're gonna run into games where it's more of a defensive battle, and you've got to rely on that punter for Oklahoma to be able to flip the field and give you some to give you some solid, field position, changes, and that's not really happened so far this year. So we'll see if that continues to be an issue going forward.
The hard numbers have Josh Plaster at 40.5 on the average on 11 punts, and Luke Elzinga punted twice.
Yeah, I mean, I think typically Turk was in the 47 to 48 yard range. So, that 10 yards per attempt, can mean the difference. So, it kind of is what it is. You know what I mean? So, he's not going to just automatically be able. I mean, you've got enough of a sample size here with that punting to know that it's probably going to be a situation where Oklahoma's just going to have to overcome that and have really good punt coverage this year. And it's still a little bit different. I mean, these stats can be skewed, right? I mean, if there's a lot of pooch punts where you're trying to get the ball inside the 20, inside the 10, that can skew the average a little bit, but I don't think there has been a lot. So, yeah, that's certainly something to keep an eye on throughout the remainder of the season.
Yeah, he's punted 11 times, which extrapolates out to 33 for the season. So if Turk's hitting 7 to 8 yards more per kick, you've lost 250 or 60 yards in field position over the course of a season.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that, and not to really give much credit to this one way or the other, because it typically evens out over the course of a year, maybe not necessarily a game, but Oklahoma didn't have the best field position. They struggled with field position throughout the game on Saturday against Cincinnati. So if you're able to have a little bit better and those flipping the field, that's something that can continue to happen, like series by series. If you're losing, if the net, you're losing 10 to 12 yards per possession, that's going to end up coming back to haunt you, and having to go 80, 85 yards every possession versus maybe having to go 65 to 70 yards. So
appreciate y'all being here at the Voice of College Football. We are presenting our Oklahoma channel and our show here, Sooners Live, that we present each Wednesday at 11:30 a.m. Central Time on SG1 Sports. You can also pick us up at the Big 12 channel that we just launched about a month ago. So please lock it in there. It's the Big 12 channel at the Voice of College Football. We will drop the link in the chat, and you can follow us there. We simulcast the Oklahoma show on our Big 12 channel. Would love for you to show up to check out all of our Big 12 coverage, including Jason's post game with the Sooners each and every week. And next up might be some recruiting notes here. Jason, a big weekend at home, so maybe not necessarily a hyped up spot for the players, but for the coaching staff, they know what's on the line going forward with some big talent in town.
Yeah, so he's already committed to Oklahoma, obviously, but David Stone's going to be in town this weekend. I think partially because one of his teammates, offensive lineman Jordan Seaton, is going to come in. He's going to come in for his official visit this weekend for Oklahoma. Big time prospect, number 2, number 3 overall offensive lineman, and I believe in the country, at least at one point. It may not necessarily be that right now. So he's going to be in town. Both of those kids are going to be in town, and there's some rumors of some others that may potentially get there. Right, I think you've got some flips that either has already happened from a decommitment perspective, or is on the cusp of potentially happening. So Reggie Powers, 4-star safety, had been committed to Michigan State. He announced his decommitment from Michigan State yesterday. Oklahoma's been in contact, so I think he's a guy that Oklahoma's really in on. I think there's a lot of mutual interest there early on. I've heard that he potentially might be on campus, not confirmed as of yet this weekend. And a name that's probably going to be near and dear to people's heart, Bryant Wesco, wide receiver, that had been a hard Oklahoma lean for quite some time, committed to Clemson. Now there's some thoughts in that camp that he could be reopening that commitment, maybe not necessarily decommitting as of yet, but reopening that commitment, where I think Oklahoma would absolutely be looking for him as a guy that. I don't know if he's either a high 4-star or low 5-star, but one of the top wide receivers in the country overall. With Clemson struggling, and then Michigan State's situation from a coaching staff perspective, those are two opportunities that Oklahoma, I think, just would be. They are jumping on, but certainly would be wise for them to jump on, as and they still got a few more slots that they're looking to fill. But they're overall, I think, number 8 overall and 247 rankings for the class. So could be another situation if some of these other pieces fall into place where they could return as a top 5 recruiting class for the 2025 cycle.
So, Jason, just looking at the raw numbers and statistically, but also the bottom lines on the scoreboard, the defensive effort this year has been near exceptional, especially if you're looking at points per game. And anyone in the conference just giving up 6 points, again, will continue to monitor Cincinnati and see how good they are. But they put up 27 against Pitt a couple of weeks earlier, went to overtime against Miami of Ohio. So, we're going to find out more and more and more. They're going to face by far the most talented team in Texas in 2 weeks. Then there's a few other offenses that are capable after that. Do you think the defense has improved considerably?
I do in a few key areas, Mark. I think the tackling, now it wasn't great against SMU. It was a little bit better against Cincinnati. I think the tackling has substantially improved, Mark. I think the play up front, defensive line play, has dramatically improved. You've got individuals that have improved. Like Ethan Downs is a much better player right now and he was a either honorable mention, like right there as an all Big 12 selection last year. So I think he's improved a lot from the defensive end. Some of the new guys that they've brought in, Rondell Bothroyd, Trace Ford, to name a few, are improving. I think Danny Stutzman is positioning himself to potentially being a first-team All-American linebacker this year. He's really playing at that level so far, and he's really not missing a ton. Like, a lot of times he would over pursue plays a little bit last year. And then when you look at the secondary, like Key Lawrence is a guy that came in and played a lot Saturday, had an interception, played really well as well. So I think what's happening this year, Mark, that you're seeing maybe a little bit more than last year, you're seeing a lot of kids really just dive head first into the culture that BV has been preaching. And you see a lot of these kids have really, even kids that have been there over the last couple of years. Key Lawrence is a guy. Woody Washington is another guy that's been around for quite some time. And Danny Stutzman obviously has been around for a few years as well. But I think one thing that was really interesting, just kind of buying into the culture, they had mentioned, and this is across the board, not just defensively, but a lot of times, like even right now, if they have a 4 p.m. practice or a workout or whatever, like they're in the facility around 11. And so like kind of buying into that culture, like kind of what you put, you're going to get out of it what you put into it. So I think, I say I'm still in a situation, and maybe it's me just watching, and I've been, kind of burned by early season success and then kind of tapering off towards, mid to late season, not just last year, but, in previous years. So I kind of in a position where I'm reserving a little bit of judgment until after Texas, right? Until now, if you're Oklahoma and you give up 21 points to Iowa State this Saturday, then that's certainly not a good sign. But if they come away from this Texas game and and they in their really competitive defense keeps them in the game, maybe even helps them win the game, then yeah, I think at that point, Mark, you can say there is a dramatic improvement. But at this point, you still can say that. But I think you want to see them play some tougher competition before you get there, because that's going to be the thing that's going to be the thing that's going to go against this team right now, is just the lack of competition that they played with SMU, and maybe I don't know who you would. It's kind of it's a coin flip for me when you look at SMU versus Cincinnati, who's the better team. But without a big time team that they've played, and that's going to be the course. So I think Texas is the barometer, because Oklahoma is going to go to a situation this year where I think Kansas is probably the only one that would be kind of teetering on that ranking scale. That Texas may be the only ranked team that Oklahoma plays all season long until you get to conference championship and obviously bowl game. So I think there's a lot of people out there that think that Oklahoma is a product of the schedule. The record is a product of the schedule that they've had right now. So I think once you get into some of those tougher games, starting with Texas, I think that's when you could really kind of completely evaluate both the offense and the defense. But at this point, that Oklahoma hasn't allowed a rushing touchdown all year. Did not allow obviously a touchdown at all to. And there's 3 games where they've only allowed a total of 1 score. 1 touchdown with a shutout against Arkansas State, no touchdowns against Cincinnati, and then just the 1 against SMU. So I think this team right now has met expectations and probably going a little bit beyond expectations on the defensive side, but it's still, for me, a little bit of a wait and see mentality.
Now, coming up in the Big 12 this week, we've got Cincinnati BYU on a Friday night. So they will have the national spotlight basically to themselves. So 2 of the newcomers to the Big 12 there. The headliner on Saturday is pretty obviously Kansas and Texas. So that, Texas is a decided favorite, but that should be pretty intriguing.
Yeah, it really should. I think you can make an argument, and even maybe a solid argument, that Kansas is the best offensive team in the conference this year. When Jalen Daniels is healthy, they're very hard to stop. So I think watching this game will be very intriguing with Texas. How good they are up front. And how good of an offensive team that Kansas is. How many, are they able to put some points on the board? So, yeah, Mark. I mean, I think when you look overall at the Big 12, we've talked about this, and I think it's continuing to set itself apart. That it's down a little bit from I think even from what a lot of us thought it would be. To me. And I know Kansas State has a loss to Missouri, but I think right now it seems that Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas State, and maybe Kansas are clearly the top 4 teams in the Big 12. And I think right now it looks like Oklahoma and Texas are probably the top 2. Houston is not a good football team. Texas Tech is probably. It'll be interesting to see what they are like without Tyler Shuck, who unfortunately is out for the year again. For them, TCU's playing a little bit better as of late, but it's the, the conference overall is not not as strong, but it's still up and down the conference, very competitive, right? But I don't think it's as strong, at the top as what we might have thought it was to start the year.
Sooners Live, folks. We come your way each and every Wednesday at 11:30 a.m. Central Time. Sometimes we've got to shift the show based on scheduling conflicts. So please subscribe and hit the bell for the notifications. We would like you to subscribe over on the Big 12 channel that we have launched here in the last month. If you go to the link that I've dropped in the chat, you can follow it directly to the Big 12 channel, and you'll see all sorts of Big 12 content in addition to Oklahoma. And yes, we know that at the end of the season that we'll make the switch to the SEC. We got that all taken care of. We got an SEC channel. We're all set there. So yeah, that's going to be kind of strange that as soon as the clock strikes double zeros on whatever bowl game Oklahoma's in, they're pretty much going to be a member of the SEC. That's going to be the complete shift that, well, nothing really matters in the Big 12, and it's all about the SEC.
Yeah, it's odd. I was just going to say, overall, Mark, it's just going to be such a strange year next year. I mean, so many moving parts. It's, I don't know about you, Mark, but just kind of looking at it nationally, it's quite, I don't know if ironic is the right word, that the Pac-12 is, I think you could say the Pac-12 is probably the best conference in the country this year. I mean, is it overtaken the SEC? I think I would probably say at this point, I would say so. Yeah, I mean, you've got, I was less than impressed with USC. I kind of had gotten on board with them, and then they just kind of laid an egg defensively, specifically against Arizona State. But I mean, you've got 3 or 4 teams that you feel pretty strong that could potentially make the playoffs. Will they beat each other up so much that not one team makes the playoffs? But Washington looks like just a big time juggernaut right now, particularly offensively. Oregon looks great. Utah's done all of this without Cam Rising. They've won a couple of big games against UCLA and then Florida to start the season. So, and then obviously you got USC as well. So I don't know. It's ironic that the Pac-12 is basically going to be done with after this year, and they're having maybe the best season that they've ever had.
I know. It is strange. It is definitely strange. And for me, I'm not completely sold on the Pac-12 necessarily being the best conference, but I go by the results. And I actually just dropped a link in the chat if everybody wants to check it out. I did conference rankings because we're at a point in the season in which almost all the non-conference games have been played. So everything on here out, you really can't rank the conferences on anything from here to the end of the regular season because there's a few out there. The ACC and the SEC get together for 4 games on Thanksgiving weekend. And of course, Notre Dame's got its slew of games against the ACC and a couple against the Pac-12, USC, Notre Dame, or Stanford. But basically, the Big 12, for example, is done playing out of conference games. SMU, TCU was the last one. So you can pretty much evaluate these conferences, at least in the regular season at this point. And if the SEC was going to line up against the Pac-12, every team, every game, they could play entire schedules. Everybody plays Alabama. Everybody plays Auburn. I would still put my money on the SEC winning, but I got to go with the results. And the results say that the Pac-12 has played the best football and delivered the best results against the other conferences. So it's the number one conference in my eyes right now. They've delivered the best results. And that's what it is. Now we'll see again, bowl season. And then there's going to be the argument about which bowl games count, which ones you have to throw away because of opt-outs and motivation. And then, of course, the playoffs are going to magnify whichever teams go more than any other. So if a conference could be down, but could have that one team carry the banner, and a lot of people are going to just look at that. Um, so yeah, it is funny that Pac-12 really had a good season last year, led by all those great quarterbacks. And to have that good of a quarterback season and have all of them except for Dorian Thompson Robinson at UCLA come back, all the rest of them came back, and so they are loaded at quarterback. And yeah, it's a really good conference. It's going to be the most competitive race at the top.
Mm-hmm.
The Big 12 is more of a muddle from two to whatever. But if
Right.
Texas pulls through, then Texas is the team. But man, the Pac 12, the top 5 or 6, who knows what's going to happen there? It's going to be intriguing. But to your point, I've said the same thing a number of times in the last few weeks. It's ironic that the Pac 12 has been beaten and battered and hasn't been able to make a playoff. And now they deliver their best football in a decade or more.
Yeah.
And they are going to be no more.
Yeah, no, I mean it's kind of sad, and I'm sure the Big Ten is just overjoyed with how good the programs are right now, Washington and Oregon. You know, sometimes that's cyclical based on quarterback play and stuff like that. But I bet they're happy. But I don't know. I mean, I really like Washington a lot. I think they are so dynamic with Michael Penix Jr. and then those three really good wide receivers. I think they're going to score on anyone. It's just are they going to be very similar to USC? I mean, those teams, and even Oregon, you could put Oregon into that as well. They're probably going to score on anyone. Can they get enough stops against a Georgia, against an Alabama, LSU from an SEC perspective to Ohio State, if you want to just pull in everyone nationally there, Michigan, are they able to get enough stops to win those games, whether it be playoff or national championship game? But yeah, it'll be interesting. I mean, you would think that one of these teams from the Pac-12 will kind of survive enough to make it to a playoff, but we shall see.
Yeah, it's kind of odd in that I don't even know who's rooting for that because all of the fan bases, of course, they're rooting for their individual teams, but there's a number of fans across the country that root for their conference. That if their team can't get through, that they want somebody from their conference, or what's happened in the Big Ten last year and the SEC twice, get 2 teams in. Just we want as much representation as possible. But if you're a Pac-12 fan, if your team's not going to make the playoff, do you really care? Because they're all going to be scattered next year anyway.
Yeah.
So I guess it doesn't much matter in terms of
Yep.
any kind of rooting interest out there outside of just rooting for your team, because there's no conference allegiance
Yeah.
anymore.
Well, and I think we've talked a lot about this internally with the Big 12, but I think it would be kind of, I don't know, to me poetic, funny if you had a Big 12 championship game of Oklahoma and Texas, and then a Pac-12 championship game of Washington and Oregon.
Yes.
Or I mean, Washington and UCLA, or Oregon and UCLA, or whatever. UCLA's down. I don't think they're quite ready just yet, but a couple of those teams.
Yes. I was looking for my Oregon State and Washington State helmets. I've held them up many times to say I have no rooting interest otherwise. I don't care who makes these conference championship games. I just love college football. Would normally not care who makes the Pac-12 championship game. But for this year, I am rooting for Washington State and Oregon State to play in the Pac-12 championship game. I would just think that would be so fitting to send the conference off with the 2 teams that were snubbed
Yeah,
making the championship game. Ironically, they just played this past week, and I was a bit surprised that Washington State won the game.
Yeah, as was I.
But just to look ahead, not really a year, but just kind of a week in the life of, if you throw Oklahoma and Texas in the middle of this week, I don't know who they'd play, but it's such just the names, regardless of how poorly the league's playing, it's just got to be a jolt, or in a positive way, I would think, for those 2 fan bases to, instead of, we just looked at the Big 12 and we saw a Texas Kansas game that should be entertaining, And other than that, I would watch any of those games, but I'm a college football guy, but nobody's getting excited about Kansas State and UCF and Cincinnati and BYU playing and that sort of
Yep.
thing. But, you see Florida on the board and Texas A&M and Georgia Auburn and Tennessee, South Carolina, and LSU and Ole Miss and Alabama. It's just kind of a different world.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. It is completely. It is a different world, and so I mean, there's a lot of excitement, absolutely, and for us as fans as well, a lot of excitement seeing, what that looks like. But yeah, I mean, there might be a situation where there's a little bit of a little bit of kind of getting acclimated to what that schedule looks like week in and week out, where they're both Oklahoma and Texas could take a few lumps. But no, I mean, I think more than anything, there's just a lot of excitement for what that week in and week out schedule will look like from a fan's perspective, if nothing else.
Jason, we appreciate all that you do here at the Voice of College Football. Everybody join Jason after the ball game against Iowa State. Sooner Tailgate Live is typically on Friday afternoons, so you can join Jason right there. Again, it's important for you to have those notifications on to know when we go live. All right, Jason, we appreciate it. Enjoy the games this weekend.
All right, will do. Thanks for having me on.